realize and understand that we really are in the presence of excellence tonight. We're in the company of honorable speakers and women and allies or assemblymen who have spent their time tirelessly in order to demand equity and equality for our communities of color against supremacy, white supremacy, and racism. And I also want to recognize and take a moment of silence in the memory of the lives of those who've been stolen by the police. And I want us to, as a community, come together tonight, bow our head in the moment of silence, and honor those lives, perhaps for a quick moment, and really remember the lives that were lost, but not forgotten. So let's bow our heads, take a moment, and we'll come back to the program. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. It's my pleasure to co-host this event with organizer and activist Ben Hawk, who is involved in environmental justice, divestment, public banking, and other systemic solution for justice. He's an organizer with Revolution LA, Public Bank LA, Divest LA, California Public Banking Alliance, DSA Long Beach, and the Progressive Delegates Network. And my sister, and chairwoman of Muslim Delegates and Allies, DNC committee member, law professor, and environmental justice activist, Nadia Ahmed. When I remember, Melina, when you and I had a conversation a couple of nights ago, we decided, you asked me, you said, I was very tired when I called you. I remember I was very tired, and I think I frazzled, right? I picked up the phone. I said, Melina, I need to talk to you. And we had a heart to heart, and you said, Hania, what's happening with you? I said, I'm not sure, but something is just not right. You said, sis, you need to find your purpose. And I think one thing led to another, right? And we talked about this bill, which is the Breathe Act. And we talked about it briefly, and we just all of a sudden said, hey, listen, let's get the progressives in California together and make sure that we introduce it to those who are not familiar with it. And why not do that? And I found my purpose that night. And what we're hoping to do here on this call is to allow the opportunity for whoever is here to find that purpose after leaving, right? And, we want to be able to allow for everyone to have a call to action after this call, right? And so what I want to do, without further ado, is introduce Gina Clayton, who is the founder and executive director of Essie Justice Group, the nation's leading advocacy organization of women with incarcerated loved ones. She's also a central architect of the Breathe Act, the largest piece of federal legislation delivered to Congress by a social movement. She has spent more than 15 years advocating for Black communities as an organizer, attorney, and advocate. She's a public defense attorney, and she is specialized in representing low-income women facing eviction as the result of family members' criminal matter. Gina previously served on the NAACP Board of Directors. She is currently a leader of the Movement for Black Lives Policy Table, a founding advisory council member of the National Bailout Collective, and the leading advocate for bail reform in California. Gina holds a BA from the University of Southern California and a JD from Harvard Law School. Gina, can you take us through the process of putting this bill together? Tell us how this bill came about and the priorities at the national level, and kind of summarize the top priorities when you decided that this bill needs to happen and come together.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, first of all, for the beautiful gathering of people here. This is I can already feel it, such a gathering of heart and like-hearted people who are up to something deliciously, audaciously good. And that is exactly the kind of space that I love to be in. And so really looking forward to what comes out of this. As you mentioned, my name is Gina Clayton-Johnson. I use she, her pronouns. And I can share a little bit about the origins of the Breathe Act, which really started in terms of under the moniker of Breathe Act last summer. But I'm also very interested in answering your question about the priorities and where we are now. And so what I'll do is I'll start talk about a little bit about the origins, talk a little bit about what's in the Breathe Act, and then move into the priorities. So last spring, I should say, we were all collectively in another wave of experiencing collectively what it is to have the reality of police terror forced into our every single day media moments, our friendships, our, with the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, to white supremacist violence. There was a way in which even those of us who've been working in this tirelessly found ourselves right here again in this moment where now there was a national attention and outcry for change. And what we experienced in that moment was something that I think is a product of organizing, is the product of the leaders like those assembled here. For the last 7 years since Ferguson, we have uplifted solutions and demands that would truly hold accountable law enforcement, that would create policies that would divest and remove resources from punitive and harmful carceral practices and invest them into things that we know keep us safe. And we've been fighting that fight locally for years. So last year, we saw in the course of a weekend, over 600 different actions on Juneteenth weekend, demanding something very different, right? It wasn't just hold the officer accountable and prosecute the cop. I mean, we care about that, certainly. But it was also this demand around budgets, right? It was this demand to say that our budgets actually need to reflect what we care about and what we believe in as a society. They need to reflect our compassion. They need to reflect our value of Black life, of brown life. And that was something that was honestly new, like not that new, right? Some of it, but like in the ways in which that ascended into the mainstream conversation, that was new. And that was exciting. And that was important because it had come from study. It had come from realizing that things like body cameras, things like police training, those things don't work. And those things are adding money to our police budgets in ways that are actually just doubling down on what we know isn't the solution, right? And so what we, I think, saw as a movement for Black lives is that now is the time when we have built infrastructure, when we have community, when we have demands. Now is the time when we need to draw down on wins across this country in the direction of reallocating the power from policing and back into communities where it belongs. And so what then happened was, and I'm just going to say, I'm not very good at playing the diplomat and, trying to hide I'm just going to say what happened was at the congressional level, we saw a realization that they too, right? Like Alfred was like, oh, we got to respond to this. And at the congressional level, we saw the introduction of a bill that was the Justice and Policing Act, right? And this conversation that we're having right now is actually very well timed because it is this week and next week when we are seeing that bill really move, right? We're actually going to be, we see it in the Judiciary Committee, it's moving through Congress right now, right? And so when we looked and read that Justice and Policing Act, we noticed a few things. We noticed, I think most importantly, that in no way was it legislating in the direction of safety for our for Black people. It was not doing the things that we had in fact, it was from by many perspectives, it was actually an invest bill. You know, we had Biden saying that we needed to put more money into policing at the same, you know, so we had these very confusing kind of national approach that in no way mirrored the demands that came from the movement. And so this was a moment when, again, we as advocates, as activists, as organizers found ourselves in the position of having to say, well, we don't like, we don't like this. And realizing that our unfortunate, you know, kind of categorizing is always like, oh, well, they don't like anything. Nothing is ever good enough. They don't have solutions. They just have critiques. And we thought, well, A, that's not true. And B, we do have a solution. So maybe let's get to it. Since they're not writing the bill, let's us write the bill. And that's where the Breathe Act came from. The Breathe Act is the answer to the question, what will it take legislatively for Black people to be safe in this country? That is what the Breathe Act is. And it comes not from kind of a hurried, let's quickly come up with a bill, you know, kind of couple week long process. I mean, it happened all very quickly. I can tell you a little bit more about that process, but it actually came from an existing policy platform that is called the Vision for Black Lives, that you can find online, that's open source, that you can download all the policy briefs, and is very, very thorough. And that Vision for Black Lives policy platform and agenda came out of over a 1.5 year long process with hundreds of members of community from across this country and over 60 groups who collectively struggled with the really hard questions, the tensions, and worked on figuring out these are the solutions that we need in our community. So it is, the Breathe Act is in consultation with that platform. And what the Breathe Act says, and so that's as much as I'll say now around the origins, and I'm happy to elaborate on any of that. But I want to move into what it says. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, please. I mean, this is you. This is all you. And I know that Sister Melina wants to talk as little as possible, so we're going to borrow some of her time. That's what you said. So we'll borrow some of your time then. So, yeah.
Sure. And that would be a disservice to everybody here, because I will take notes and pull out my pen and paper when Dr. Melina Abdullah is talking. But I do want to kind of share the pieces of the Breathe Act so that everyone really knows what it says, and then move into kind of what our priorities are so that we can all be partners together in figuring out these next steps and really moving it forward. So there are the Breathe Act, by the way, is available. You can find it online at breatheact.org, and you click through the website and find the place where it says download the act. You can download the whole thing. And I would really suggest you start a study group and have some Zoom conversations with friends, nerd out on this document. I think, just reading aloud certain sections of it had me in tears. And I've been doing this work and feel sometimes a little jaded by policy texts. And this is one that really just reads like a poem because of the ways in which the solutions resonate and ring so true. So section 1, it's divided into 4 sections. Section 1 is all about it's all about removing the resources that have gone to fueling and funding mass incarceration and our punitive carceral policies that have landed us in this place where we are seeing the horrors of state violence on the daily. And so this is where we divest from places like DOJ programs like 1033, the COPS program, programs that have provided money to local law enforcement agencies to buy, all kinds of equipment that have created the positionality of people versus the police departments as though they are communities at war. This is the section that really shuts all of that down and immediately removes the resources. What's important about how we did that section as well is that we understood that burn JAG funding isn't only funding carceral and harmful, what we see as harmful activities and programs. it is also doing some good things and some things we want to preserve. And so we were very careful to ensure that anything that is non-carceral, non-punitive finds its resources and elsewhere in another department. And so we have wind down kind of provisions in that section. And so I just want to share that because of the ways in which I'm really proud of our team for really tackling some of the more detailed and difficult pieces of this. But that's essentially what Section 1 is. Section 2 is this section that incentivizes states and local places to decarcerate and decriminalize. And so what we're saying here is that we will actually provide grants to states and counties and local communities if they do things like end the practice of solitary confinement, decarcerate their local jail populations, end money bail. You know, we have a whole list of things that they can apply. If they do this, they can apply and become competitive for grants from the federal government. That money gets then they can use that money to invest in the things that we know are much more effective and evidence-based ways that keep our communities safe. So mental health care, housing, et cetera. And so there's a whole list of things that that states are incentivized to do in Section 2 that they would then get money for. So there are 3 grant programs that help provide that. Section 3, if Section 2 is all about Section 1 and Section 2 is all about kind of winding down the police state, the carceral infrastructure. Section 3 is about how can we ensure that our communities are thriving. So I always like to talk about, like, Section 2 is if this is about us surviving, making sure we don't die. Section 3 is about how do we make sure that we thrive, that we have access to things like housing, to healthcare, to education. And so we actually have 5 signature grants in those areas: environmental justice grants, health grants, housing grants, family health and family grants, economic justice grants, and education grants. And so there's a lot of different ideas up in there, including 12 million permanently affordable housing units being built, universal basic income, baby bonds programs. I mean, this is like the bus and omnibus. It is where the bill gets really huge. But I think it really also just very much spells out what the roadmap is in terms of this is actually what a society that cares about Black people, about brown people, and about one another looks like. Section 4 is all about accountability, accountability at the ballot box, accountability for state violence, so including reparations, as well as banning things like no knock warrants and other kinds of, and creating funds for people who have family members who have lost loved ones to policing and criminal justice and criminal legal system violence. So that's the very broad brushstrokes of the 4 sections. How this plays out at the state level will look different depending on the states. And I know we're going to get into what state Breathe Acts could look like. In terms of the priorities, and now I really do feel like I've been speaking for a little bit too long, so I'm just going to go quickly, and then I would love to just be in conversation. So one of the things that we recognize is that the political will, when we brought this bill to Congress and said, look at what we have, was absolutely not there, right? We had a Trump administration, we had Congress was what it was, and yet there were people inside of Congress, particularly on the staffers, talked to the CPC, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus members. I mean, we were talking to everybody, and multiple people helped us with the actual bill. And so there was an appetite, but there was also a lot of hesitance, political hesitance. And this is where movement matters, right? This is where we need to show up inside of our district spaces and call attention to the Breathe Act and say, we actually need you to hold hearing on the Breathe Act. We want you to pay attention to these solutions and create space to have these conversations. And that's one of my first asks, is that every one of us has a representative, right, in Congress that we can go to today, tomorrow, and say, we're asking that you hold a hearing on the Breathe Act. And you can take a look at what committees they're in and that sort of thing, but will you help us get a hearing? It's very important to kind of create that political opening. So that's number one. Number two is Breathe Acts. We absolutely want to create momentum from the ground up. And so that looks like passing Breathe Acts locally at the county level, at the state level. We actually have model bills that we can share and provide tech assistance with at the Movement for Black Lives. And then the third piece is that we want there to be another thing that you can do is to pass local resolutions. So Compton City Council actually passed under the phenomenal leadership of Mayor Brown, passed a local resolution supporting the federal Breathe Act. This is a huge step forward in both a federal and a local space, because what that means is that your local government is saying, we have a commitment to invest, divest. We have a commitment to this framework that then you can move, kind of smart organizing to implement that locally. But you also have a evidence of local support for something that needs to happen federally that we can then use to advance the legislation at the congressional level. So I know I'm already going to get this question, so I'll just say, we have champions. Rashida Tlaib has been one of the foremost incredible, love her champion of this bill, and Ayanna Pressley, have been really, really out in front with the Breathe Act from the get. Champions are different than sponsors. We have yet to solidify our sponsors, and those are complicated questions about who's going to be able to run this thing through legislative counsel's office, what kind of collection of sponsors do we need so that they can get through different committees and that kind of thing. And so we are right now in that process of figuring that out and trying to push in all the ways that we need to. So that's the update on the Breathe Act. I'm so happy to share it with y'all and really excited to incorporate all of the wisdom that you bring into our strategy and work.
And thank you so much, Gina. I did have a chance to actually read the bill. It is 128 pages of just goodness. It's intricate and it is so detailed, and it just pictures an America where there's equity and equality for every single one of us to stand shoulder to shoulder and just demand basic human rights, right? So I'm very pleased that you took this time to really elaborate on this. And I had an opportunity to really go over the website, and there's a section which we'll introduce to everyone where you can, we're gonna do a call to action at the end of the call, where you can send an email to your Congress member and tweet from your Twitter using the toolkit that's provided to you. So there are tools which we will use at the end of this call to stay engaged and make sure that our voices are heard. So I will pass it over to my sister Nadia to introduce the queen herself, Sister Melina Abdullah of Black Lives Matter. And Sister Nadia, take it away, please.
Thank you so much, Attorney Gina Clayton. I also wanted to thank Sister Hania as well. And really, I think what we're witnessing right now with the bringing forward of the Breathe Act is a level of emancipation. And I think it's really important for us to also take in the moment and the magnitude of this piece of legislation. So it's really my honor to introduce next Dr. Melina Abdullah, who is a professor and former chair of Pan-African Studies at California State University in Los Angeles. She was appointed to the Los Angeles County Human Rights Commission in 2014 and is a recognized expert on race, gender, class, and social movements. Dr. Abdullah is an author of numerous articles and book chapters on subjects ranging from political coalition building to womanist mothering. Professor Abdullah is a womanist scholar activist, understanding the role that she plays in the academy as an intrinsically linked to broader struggles for the liberation of oppressed people.
Hey, so, sis.
Yes.
You don't have to read anything else. Thank you. Is that all right? I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead. But, well, I want to say one more thing. So okay. I just wanted to say, in short, you're a movement, and we're just really honored to have you here. Thank you.
Shukran. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm just really grateful to Sister Hania for, she described that conversation that we had And anybody who knows Sister Hania knows that as soon as she figures something out and decides on something, she immediately springs into action and makes it happen. So grateful to have this conversation. And of course, deeply grateful to be in community and family with Sister Gina Clayton-Johnson, who I've come to know over the last several years as one of the most visionary and beautiful and powerful and thoughtful and audacious and courageous sisters that I know. And so I'm grateful for your vision on this work. I'm grateful for what the Breathe Act represents. And I don't have to say a whole lot about the Breathe Act because I think Gina just laid it out really powerfully. So I just want to kind of encourage us to take on the power and potential of this moment, right? And so we're kind of watching as government, as the powers that be try to lure us into the misunderstanding of history that we should somehow seek to go back to some previous time where we were freer. Well, I'm gonna be clear, I'm a Black woman. There was no previous time that I was freer. And so we can only go forward. And what we should be doing is thinking about this moment as a moment that the world has cracked wide open, that the blood spilled of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Dijon Kizzee and Frederick Williams and Waukesha Wilson and so many others is propping open this portal into a magnificent future where we can have all of what we want, when we can truly usher in what Robin Kelly calls freedom dreams. And what's kind of posing a threat to that possibility is the idea that, well, if we just go back, if we just revise, if we just tinker around the edges of fundamentally unjust systems, that somehow that's enough. But that's not how we honor the spirit of George Floyd. That's not how we honor the spirit of Brother Africa. That's not how we honor Yvette Henderson and Nia Wilson and so many others. How we honor them is making sure that we are visionary in this work. And I think about this moment as something akin to the civil rights movement as it was transitioning into Black power, right? I think about this moment and the massive nature of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, coupled with the on-the-ground work that said we're not just seeking assimilation and inclusion into a system that keeps the boot on the necks of Black people, of brown people, of indigenous people, of poor people. We're seeking to fundamentally transform that system. And that's what we saw with the uprising in Watts in 1965, right? That's what we saw with the birth of the Black Panther Party in 1966 and the ushering in of Black power as brilliantly articulated by people like Kwame Ture in 1967. And so what the Breathe Act offers us an opportunity to do is to really summon those kinds of powerful spirits and say that, you know, we are not tinkering around the edges. We are not going to put a kinder, gentler face on systems of mass incarceration, systems of policing that hail from slave catching. We're going to say, just as Mama Harriet Tubman had to say, we are toppling the whole damn thing. We are going to topple the whole damn thing. We have to be brilliant enough and brave enough and courageous enough and faithful enough to say that we have the power in this moment to say that no more prisons, no more jails, no more policing, that we have community-driven solutions, that when people have all of what they need and most of what they want, when we create a society where people can step into their fullest selves, that we will live in a space of true justice and freedom. And so what we're asking, what we're saying, what we're visioning with the Breathe Act is that all of us will be unafraid, will be courageous, and will untether ourselves from a system that has never meant freedom for people like me and Gina and our children, right? That will untether ourselves from that system and will say, well, what does freedom look like? And so it means absolutely advocating with everything that we can for the passage of a federal Breathe Act, not some watered down version of what a kind of reformed system can look like, but a completely reimagined system. And that everywhere that we stand, including at the state level, including especially in places like California, where we've always been visionary and always have had the opportunity to set the tone for the rest of the nation, that we can be the state that adopts an actual Breathe Act, right? The people here are ready for it. If we look at what people are saying that they want, if we look at the landslide passage of measures like Measure J, if we look at how people have hopped on this idea of progressive justice reform and voted in district attorneys like George Gascon and Chesa Boudin, if we look at the ways in which people have flooded the streets by the hundreds of thousands at a single action, then we know that this is time. This is the time for a Breathe Act. And so we're asking you in every space that you occupy, to think about what it means to be an abolitionist. And I'll be quiet after this, but I want to remind us that in the midst of Women's History Month, we're not just pointing to white women, liberal white women, who are trying to kind of gain inclusion into a system that wasn't designed for the rest of us. We're also we should be pointing to examples like Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell and Ella Baker and Audre Lorde and so many others. And we should be saying, what does it mean to truly do something courageous? We should be thinking about things like the Combahee River statements. And we should be saying, what brings freedom to Black women, Black children, and Black people? And I would submit that legislatively, there is no solution other than the Breathe Act, that now is the time to be courageous. Now is the time to usher it in federally, statewide, locally. Now's the time to use our platforms and to use our organizations. I'm incredibly grateful, not just to the Black women and other women of color and Muslim delegates, but also to the white sisters. I know Erica Ferristine is on, and I'm grateful to her for being willing to, really say that I am going to sacrifice my white privilege and utilize my white privilege to usher in something that's meaningful, because we know that when we pass pieces like the Breathe Act, when we stand shoulder to shoulder with the Black folks who are leading this fight in this moment, that we're also ushering in a world that's fit for the lives of our children and our grandchildren to come. So again, I'm just grateful for this space and grateful for what I'm confident of, and I have faith that will actually be meaningful, that will actually usher in something meaningful. So again, thank you so much for having me.
Sister Melina, just to piggyback off of your point here, when you and I spoke about having this intimate session with the delegates of California and the progressives of California, which some of us are delegates to the DNC, not DNC, but the state delegates, I approached some of the progressive organizations, and without a hesitation, they were on board and supporting. So with us, we have Progressive Democrats of America, Middle East Alliances, Healthcare for All Los Angeles. We have Progressive Delegates Network. We have our Revolution Orange County. So thank you for your support, and let's hope that we carry this message throughout our day-to-day action. And I will hand this back over to Nadia to introduce our next guest, Assembly Member Ash Kalra.
Thank you. I'm pleased to introduce Assemblymember Ash Kalra, who was the first elected to the California legislature in 2016, representing California's 27th district. In 2020, he was reelected to his third term. He is the chair of the State Assembly Labor and Employment Committee and also serves as a member of the Housing and Community Development, Judiciary, Transportation, and Water, Parks, and Wildlife Committees. He has established himself as a leader on issues ranging from criminal justice reform to the environment, as well as healthcare sustainability, housing affordability, growing our transportation infrastructure, as well as expanding economic opportunity to all Californians. He will speak about the social justice dimensions of the legislation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and for inviting me here. And it's always great to connect with our delegates. And there's no doubt, and I think some of you know the work that we've done together over the years, especially the last couple of years in terms of criminal justice reform. But there's no doubt, as we've already heard from our other speakers, that given what we've seen over the past year, there is not just a sense of urgency, but there's an opportunity for us to do more than we've ever done before. And so I absolutely believe that local jurisdictions, whether it's in cities and counties, as we've seen with Chesa Boudin, George Gascon, and others who are really pushing the envelope, and by the way, are facing a lot of criticism with these recall efforts by those that want to hold tightly to the status quo. But we're also seeing in California and Sacramento a number of bills that have been put forward that are in the theme of the BREATHE Act, and certainly speak to the social justice nature of what it is that we need to do. And some of them we've not been able to get through yet. We've gotten some through, certainly in terms of a lot of the criminal justice reforms in terms of enhancements and what have you, but we have to dig deeper. And we know the governor vetoed the Crisis Act this past year, which is one of the elements of the BREATHE Act in terms of having non-sworn police officers respond to 911 calls, to actually have those that are trained in mental health, that are trained not with a gun and a badge, but are actually trained in social service, in psychology, in mental health, in trauma. And so I know that bill's been reintroduced again this year, and certainly going to continue to support that. I do want to mention last year I was honored to have authored the Racial Justice Act. It was passed and signed by the governor, and with that, California became the first state in the nation that now allows a criminal defendant, a defense attorney, to challenge an arrest, the conduct during a trial, the conviction, or the sentencing based on race. And what that means is it's not just explicit intentional racism where it's very obvious, but implicit bias, which means that they can use data. If they can show that in a particular county that Black defendants are given sentences 4 times higher than white defendants for the same crime, they can challenge the sentencing. And and that's just one example of many things that can be done with the Racial Justice Act. And this year I've introduced AB 256, the Racial Justice Act for All, to make it retroactive. And so when we talk about things that we can do at the local level, including at the state level, there are a lot of things that we need to continue to push forward. I've introduced AB 655, the CLEAR Act. The CLEAR Act would actually intentionally root out those with ties with organizations, white supremacist and white nationalist organizations, from law enforcement. Also something that hasn't been done in this nation. I think January 6th certainly gives us some wind behind our sails in that regard. I will mention 2 more things. One last thing on legislation I'll mention is I have a single payer bill this year, AB 1400. And when we think about medical healthcare for all and single payer, it is an economic justice issue. It is a racial justice issue. It is a social justice issue. When you have, for example, we just saw from June of 2019 to June of 2020, Black life expectancy went down 2.7 years in this country in 1 year. And Latino life expectancy went down 1.9 years. And so when we look at the BREATHE Act and we look at reimagining law enforcement, it's really about reimagining public safety. We have allowed others to define what public safety means. When we know flooding the streets with more police officers and law enforcement does not equate to public safety. We need to get law enforcement out of our schools, We need to make sure that we have resources in our community for better jobs, we need resources for better mental health and substance use treatment and job training. And we need to make sure, and I have a bill actually this year that would actually, right now, as many of you know, our schools are required to call the police whenever there's anything that happens on campus that could be considered criminal conduct. I have a bill that would remove that requirement because we know who the police gets called on. We know who gets arrested. Those are the kinds of things that we have to continue to do. At the end of the day, we have to recognize that although, as Melina Abdullah put very well in terms of the roots and the systemic roots of racism in our nation, it's not about playing around the edges. It's not about just saying we're going to deal with one little code section, or we're going to do a little bit more on training. No, we have to recognize that every facet of our society is deeply racist and has been for generations and generations since before the inception of this nation. And so for us, if we don't acknowledge that, then we're not going to put forward solutions that actually deal with rooting out that racism. And I think in law enforcement, it's the most pervasive and the most hurtful because of the amount of power that we give to our justice system to strip people away from their families and their communities, to cage them, and to not allow them to have the opportunity to live as full, complete humans with dignity. And so that's why the Breathe Act nationally is something that we all need to support. And what that means locally in our counties is support efforts that are happening with our progressive district attorneys, and make sure there are plenty of DA's races coming up this next year and a couple years after that. Pay attention to those races so we can root it out at our local county level. And in Sacramento, we have bills to, for example, to demilitarize our police, to reallocate resources. We have to make sure that we're paying attention, not just to what's happening in Washington, D.C., because when California can pass some of these things in Sacramento, when we can pass at the state level, we build a momentum to make sure that other states pass it, and ultimately that in Washington, D.C., we can pass national legislation to continue to move us along the path of racial justice, of a reckoning of our racist past, but more importantly, of making sure as we move forward that we're acting in the spirit of the millions that were marching in the streets over the past year. So I just want to thank all of you for inviting me. I really appreciate the delegates, because you're the ones that are going to allow us within the Democratic Party to be able to move in a way that's just and that's equitable, but more importantly, that's compassionate. And when we get pushback, including from some Democrats that say you're moving too fast or you're moving too far, we're going to say, hell no. We're going to move at the pace of justice, and justice dictates that right now we move with urgency. So thank you all.
Thank you, Assembly Member, and we appreciate everything that you do as an ally for us. When we originally planned this get together, we wanted to have a roundtable for a discussion with our honorable speakers, but we are running behind time. So I do want to ask a question of Sister Gina here, and then we will open it up to some questions from the audience, and then we'll go to call to action, because I know it's a little bit late, and I know our sister is tired, and so we want to wrap it up quick. But we will stay, our audience will stay for call to action, I'm sure. Sister Gina, someone who's from the Middle East, when we talk about military spending in this country, or let's say when we talk about cutting the military spending by 10%, I always think about, or my concern is, for example, Yemen, Syria, Iran. I grew up during the war of Iran and Iraq, and I still remember vividly having to run downstairs in our basement because we didn't know if a bomb was going to drop on us or not, right? So that to me is the reason why I fight for military cuts here. It's a popular idea, in the Congress as well. And so when we talk about movement for Black lives, we usually link that with defunding the police. But when I started reading the bill, that was the very first thing that I saw, right? Military cuts. Can you explain to us, for some of us who haven't read the bill, how that relates to the movement for Black lives, and how that would benefit us when we cut the military spending by 10%. Some of us would prefer 50%, Some of us would say 100%, right? There shouldn't be a war anywhere, but alas, here we are. So can you elaborate on what that would do for our country, for our communities, in particular Black and Brown communities?
Absolutely, and I really appreciate that question and the perspective that you bring around this. This was not a complicated question for us because it is simply part of our commitment as a movement to recognize that we are part of not a national struggle for liberation of all Black people, but a global struggle for liberation. And then that has always been true. Since the moments when our ancestors took up the mantle that we now carry. And so I am clear that 10% is definitely a start. I think that there's been a kind of unfettered excess in the direction of piling on resources for military equipment, military intervention that has gone to destabilizing, harming, killing, creating trauma for largely Black and Brown people across this globe. That has been true domestically in the way that we see policing, carceral power, and our punitive interventions here, and that has been true in other parts of the world. And so this is a reflection of that commitment. I'll also say that as a Black feminist, and the Breathe Act is a Black feminist agenda in policy, that we see our approaches consistently being patriarchal in nature, ones that prioritize control, domination, isolation, over community healing, and the things that we know really work, right, towards safety and towards creating the kind of world we all want to live in. And so I also just want to hearken back to the underlying ideology, right? That is a Black feminist ideology that really pushes an abolitionist ideology that makes questions like the one that you ask feel very obvious to us, because we are up to liberation. We are up to creating freer and safer and more thriving communities in which all people have access to the joy and the resources and the purposes inside of each of us that life brings. And so, that is where that comes from. I can go on, about the specifics, but we were very clear, and we had some interesting conversations with some members of Congress who said, well, if you take this out, maybe I could get with this. And we wouldn't budge. We wouldn't budge because it's that important to us.
Thank you so much for that answer. I will hand it now to Ben Hauk to open it up to the audience for the questions, and we'll go to call to action.
Excellent. Thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, we do have time for a few, so please feel free to raise your hand. I did have a couple questions that came through in the chat. So the first question we'll be asking is from Dr. Saradine, and she asks, has the Breathe Act been introduced at the state level or in Congress? Or is this event to increase awareness and enthusiasm ahead of the bill being introduced?
I'll just very briefly say, the Breathe Act in the form that it's been introduced in DC or has been talked about in Congress has not been introduced in one form in Sacramento. There are a number of bills that have different elements of it that I think could likely be packaged in a way where, it's very similar, but we have to get those bills through. And that's where I think the disjointed nature of it makes it more complicated. But I'm happy to follow up with what all the bills are regarding reform.
Excellent. Thank you, Assembly Member. So the next question is from Justin Sampson. He says, I'm a congressional candidate in Orange County, and I want to help in the efforts to have my representative, Lou Correa, sign on and to champion the Breathe Act. As a candidate, How can I help in those efforts to raise awareness about the bill and put pressure on my rep and others to sign on?
Well, I'm happy to answer. So anyone can go to the breatheact.org and sign on as a community co-sponsor. But in terms of elected officials, local elected officials, we are definitely tracking local officials who are willing to endorse the Breathe Act, particularly through the passage of resolutions. I uplifted Mayor Brown earlier. And so those types of activities are really important because they do help us develop the kind of momentum that we need at the federal level. And so welcome that. I also, I am available and accessible. If you have ideas or thoughts, my email is, I can drop it in the chat or just share it, gina@essejusticegroup.org. We are in the process of actually drafting a state version of the Breathe Act for California, which our process looks like first actually bringing it to our communities and our members, then moving it into our kind of partners spaces, and then bringing it, having conversations with legislators for the 2022 introduction. So that's, being very open about that. There, as the Assembly member shared, there are a number of things that California has actually already led on that may not apply quite the same way because California has been a leader, and yet there's a long way to go in California too. So there's a process that we want to be inside of that looks like really making sure that the Breathe Act in California is as audacious as the Breathe Act is in the congressional level. But what that will mean is that there are just different choices to make, and so that's where we are in terms of the the part of the process.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gina. And we'll have one more question here. And just to let you know, everyone, we are going to be doing some calls to action towards the end of the event here. So we're going to be going through the website and doing some participation while we're here. So next up, wanted to have Fatima. Let's go ahead and unmute you and have you go ahead and ask your question. Oops, sorry.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay, I just did it. Sorry about that, Ben. Yeah. Really love that you put this together, Hania, and all the other co-hosts. It's really super useful. I worked as a public school teacher in Watts, and I know firsthand, like that. A lot of times we don't talk about education at the state level. So this member's directed to Assemblymember Ash and anyone else as well who wants to answer. But I know we've historically always been one of the lowest in per pupil funding. I haven't seen any drastic change really made to that in terms of the funding we allocate, equitable funding, right, to lower income communities. So I'm wondering, is there any goals, this session or in the very near future to do that? Because I see high quality schools and after school programs as, part of that way that we really make it equitable for our Black and Brown youth. The second question I have is just the qualified immunity bill that didn't pass. And I'm wondering if there's any plans to bring that back as well, because that's definitely something that could change, things systemically as well.
On the second one, I'll find out. I don't know if someone's introduced it. I haven't heard that, and I think we probably would have heard it if someone had. But I'll double check on that when I ask my staff to look through the bills. I'll speak quickly here on the first one. I agree 100%. I've taught in schools in DC. I've taught here in San Jose, and 100% correct. I've taught law school, and the reality is that we have a built-in system that disadvantages poor neighborhoods. It's been challenged at the Supreme Court. San Antonio v. Rodriguez. And of course, the family member who brought it on behalf of their kid lost. And so we do have to do far more. And I'll tell you one other thing. In this pandemic, this pandemic has exposed inequities that have been long-standing in education. Here in Silicon Valley, where I am, there are kids that are so disconnected. They do not have access to the internet, and they're falling more and more behind. So I guess I would say good news to some extent is that we just gave $6 billion to local districts, $4 billion of which is to try to help with catching students up. The problem is that a lot of the students we're talking about catching up were already behind, and now they're even further behind. And so I agree 100% that we need to do more. We did add more this last couple of years to schools regarding, trying to help schools that have lower test scores and what have you. But our funding system for our education system is fundamentally flawed. It's fundamentally racist in its outcomes because of that. And I'm more than happy to work with you on ideas of what we can do more. But take a look at the $4 billion we're putting in terms of trying to help students and districts kind of catch up and get students back on track, and see if there's opportunities there to get that funding into districts that need it the most.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Assembly Member, and thank you very much for the question, Fatima. We appreciate everyone who's here with us tonight. Thank you so much, and I'll hand it back to Hani.
Thank you, Ben. I just want to conclude the evening by saying that it has been an honor and a great pleasure to build this momentum with you, my sister Gina, who I look forward to continuing this conversation with, and my sister Melina, who inspires me and continues to, you know, I'm truly blessed, not only to have you as a mentor, but someone who not only is always there, but someone who's always ready to make a difference. Yeah, Hania, let's do this. Let's do that. You know, let's put together an event. Absolutely, always there. And Melina, thank you for your time. I know you're tired. I know that you have had a long day. Assembly Member Ash Kalra, I look forward to working with you. If there's anything that I need to share with our audience members here, please provide that to me and I'll be more than happy to share. And what we will do is we'll say goodbye to our guest speakers, and we will remain for one call to action, which is going to probably take about 5 minutes, and we'll wrap up the evening. Thank you, Sister Melina.
Can I say something before I sign off?
Sure.
I just want to say thank you again, Hania. We know what it means that your child is in another room. We know what it means that you are taking the time to do this, and we're grateful for you and your constant willingness to give of yourself. And so everybody on this call, thank you. We're going to make this happen. We're going to do it for our children and for our world, and grateful for everybody who's committed to this work, especially you, Hania.
Thank you. Thank you, Melina. I appreciate you truly. Thank you, and have a beautiful evening, Assembly Member Gina and my sister Melina. Thank you. So for those of you who are going to stay and take part in call to action, I'm going to share the website with you all. And it's going to be very simple. The instructions are provided. They're there. Click on call to action or take action. If you scroll down, there are 4 things you can do, which what I would recommend is to send an email to your Congress member. So all you would have to do is click on, wait, I lost it. Let's go. Click on the button. And all you have to do is put your first name, last name, zip code, email. And you can adjust the content of the email to your liking and send the email.
And that's under the action 1, the Breathe in Congress action.
Yeah. And Alan, you had your hand raised, I believe, correct? Oh, hang on. I'm going to have to.
There we go. Yeah, I just, sorry, I thought there was going to be an opportunity to speak when the guests were still here. And I just want to say, obviously PDA's had a great relationship with Rashida Tlaib's office.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's my understanding that the bill has not formally been introduced into Congress. Is that correct? Yeah, because PDA, we will definitely deploy fully in support of the Breathe Act. However few co-sponsors it gets in its, form that it is currently in, we will definitely support this, because I just feel that everything Melina said is so absolutely true. I mean, we're so, and the general public supports this level of radicality because they understand it's a necessity.
So
and politicians won't move. So I just wanted to say that. And it's a beautiful event, Hanea. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan. And I want to give a shout out to Lauren Fialco for doing our tick for us tonight. She is just one of the most incredible women I've ever met. Just on point. Every single time we have an event, we go to her to do our tick, and she's just the most amazing person. So when I was—
Well, thanks. Okay, now I'm going to go off live now that you said all that nice stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
I got
Thank you. So when I was